Hey, Soul Stories fam. We're starting a new love journey. Tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family. Now stay with us. The story begins. The first week of December passed in an unusually slow rhythm, as if the city itself were deliberately lowering its voice before Christmas. The snow didn't fall heavily, just enough to dust rooftops and sidewalks with a thin white layer, soft as a whisper. Strings of warm yellow lights had been hung early, their reflections glowing in the windows of small shops, creating a strange sense of warmth amid the early winter cold. Clara Whitmore stood in her mother's kitchen, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, her eyes fixed on the lesson plans in front of her, while her mind was completely elsewhere. "Are you listening to me?" Her mother's voice came from the dining table, firm enough to sound serious, gentle enough to sound loving. "Christmas isn't meant for you to sit alone with textbooks." Clara let out a breath, a long one, but very light, as if afraid of breaking the quiet of the familiar house. "I'm not sitting alone," she said calmly. "I have students and final exams." Yeah. Her mother set the newspaper down and looked straight at her daughter. "You have a whole life outside of school too, Clara." The words weren't new, but on a morning in early December, amid the smell of waffles and the sound of wind slipping through the cracks in the door, they suddenly felt heavier than usual. "Just one date," her mother continued, her voice softer. "A blind date. Helen's friend set it up. They say he's normal." "Normal is the scariest word in dating," Clara muttered. "Normal is safe," her mother replied, "and safe doesn't make you cry." Clara didn't answer. She had cried enough, almost a year ago, in a wedding dress she never got to wear a second time. But her mother didn't mention it, and neither did Clara. Between them was an unspoken agreement that past would be carefully put away, like a fragile box. And so, that morning, Clara slipped on her cream-colored coat, wrapped a light beige wool scarf around her neck, and stepped out of the house with the feeling that she was going to do something harmless. No expectations, no excessive defenses. Just a date, exactly as her mother had said. Holly and Ink sat on the corner of an old street, wedged between a handmade Christmas decor shop and a second-hand bookstore that had been there so long no one remembered when it first opened. Ivy climbed up the red brick wall. The large windows were always fogged with steam, and inside there was a constant blend of roasted coffee and old paper in the air. Clara loved this place. She had graded papers here, read poetry here, spent afternoons simply sitting and watching the snow fall beyond the glass. But today, for the first time, she was here because of someone else. She pushed the door open at exactly 10 o'clock. The small wind chime hanging above it rang softly, a light, delicate sound. The cafe wasn't crowded. A few people sat scattered around, mostly regulars. Clara scanned the room, her spirits dipping slightly at the thought of having to recognize a stranger based solely on the description normal. Then she saw him. The man sat near the window, leaning lightly against a wooden chair, a steaming cup of black coffee in front of him. He wore a gray coat, frayed at the cuffs, his hair slightly messy, as if he'd just walked a long distance through the snow. One hand held a brown paper pastry bag. The other was gripping the leash of a dog. No, more accurately, trying to. The dog, a cream-white mutt that looked as though it had lived through a few winters outdoors, suddenly lunged forward, charging straight toward the counter and dragging the chair behind it, which let out an awkward screech entirely out of sync with the Christmas mood. "Wait, Snowy!" The man jumped to his feet. Too late. Snowy skidded across the wooden floor, tail wagging wildly, and in that moment of chaos, a cup of hot cocoa on a young server's tray tipped over, sloshing across a table. The entire cafe fell silent for half a second. "Oh no, I'm so sorry," the server exclaimed. It's okay," the man said quickly, bending down to grab Snowy. "That's my fault." Clara stood frozen at the entrance, the scene in front of her making her both amused and confused. This was nothing like the blind dates she had imagined. No roses, no suits, no measuring glances. Just a stray dog, a worn coat, and the smell of hot cocoa spreading through the air. The man looked up, his eyes meeting hers. Clara? He asked, his voice low but kind, with a hint of hesitation. She nodded. Yes. He let out a breath, as if he'd just completed a difficult task. I'm Elliot. Nice to meet you. Sorry for the noisy introduction. She laughed before she could stop herself. A small laugh, but real. I thought you were a pastry delivery guy. Elliot blinked, then laughed too, a little awkwardly. And I thought you were a tutoring student. Guess we're even. They sat down at a table near the window. Snowy settled neatly at Elliot's feet, ears perked in alertness, but eyes strangely gentle. Clara removed her scarf, set her bag down, and for the first time in months, her heart didn't feel pulled tight like a stretched wire. Do you come here often? She asked, just to fill the silence. Pretty often, Elliot replied. It's quiet, and Snowy likes it here. As if recognizing his name, Snowy let out a very small bark. They ordered drinks. Clara chose chamomile tea. Elliot ordered black coffee, no sugar. No sugar? She asked. No, he said, then smiled. I'm used to the bitterness. That sounds philosophical for a blind date. Sorry, he chuckled softly. Occupational habit. What do you do for work? Elliot hesitated for a brief moment, long enough for Clara to notice, but not long enough to make her suspicious. I work with schools, mostly behind-the-scenes support. Nothing glamorous. Clara nodded. She didn't ask more, not out of politeness, but because, for the first time, she genuinely didn't care about the detailed answer. They talked about books, about children who loved reading but didn't have access to books, about how Christmas became more stressful as people grew older. Elliot didn't ask how much she made, didn't ask why she was still single, didn't ask about her past. He simply listened. At some point, Clara realized she was sharing more than she had planned. About her classroom, about a student who always sat in the back row, about loving her job even though it wasn't impressive. Elliot looked at her, his expression softening. If you like what you do, he said slowly, then that's enough. There were no flowery words, no promises, but the sentence touched something deep inside her, a place no one had reached in a long time. When they stood to leave, Elliot didn't ask for her phone number. He didn't suggest meeting again. He simply dipped his head slightly, holding Snowy's leash firmly. It was nice meeting you, Clara, he said. I hope you have a gentle Christmas. She watched him walk outside, his figure blending into the white snow and golden lights. On her way to the car, Clara laughed softly to herself, shaking her head in disbelief. At the very least, he hadn't made her feel the need to be on guard. And that, for her right now, was already a beginning unlike any she had known before. There was a time when Clara Whitmore believed in forever in a very simple way. Not loudly, not overly romantic. Just a quiet faith that if two people were sincere enough, patient enough, they would walk together to the end of the road. That belief lived in the smallest things. Weekend mornings making coffee together, half-finished books stacked by the bedside, a house whose location was still unknown, but which would certainly have windows to let in the sun. That belief was shattered nearly a year ago in a wedding dress fitting room flooded with white light. Clara still remembered that day with painful clarity, as if her body had never allowed the memory to fade. The room was lined with mirrors from ceiling to floor, reflecting her in an ivory wedding dress, lace hugging her shoulders, the skirt falling softly to the floor like a promise written in silk. Her mother stood behind her, hands covering her mouth, eyes red with emotion. The saleswoman smiled, nodding repeatedly, saying the dress was as if it had been made just for her. Clara had looked at herself in the mirror and thought, oh, so this is what it feels like to belong to a future. Her phone vibrated in the pocket of the coat hanging in the corner. A text message, then a missed call, then another message. His name appeared on the screen. The man who had held her hand for 4 years, who just the night before had been talking about the guest list and flower colors. I'm sorry, his voice came through the phone. Steady, unhurried, just distant. I don't think we should continue. Clara laughed instinctively. Are you joking? I'm trying on my wedding dress. There was silence on the other end. Then he spoke very slowly, very clearly, each word measured before being released. I need someone who's more compatible with my future. There was no third person, no dramatic betrayal, just a future redrawn, and she was no longer in it. The days that followed passed like a series of disconnected images. Wedding invitations already sent could not be taken back. Hesitant phone calls from friends. The wedding dress was placed back in its box, returned to the shop in silence. Clara still went to class, still lectured, still graded papers, as if life could go on purely by habit. But somewhere inside, something had broken. Not with a crack, not with a collapse, just a quiet fracture. From then on, Clara began to fear men whose eyes were always fixed on what lay ahead. She feared talk of ambition, progress, big futures. She no longer trusted long-term plans spoken with confident certainty. She started to believe that stability was only a temporary state before someone realized they wanted more, and left. The morning after the blind date at Holly and Ink, Clara woke earlier than usual. Snow was still falling, thin and silent. She made tea, sat by the window, and suddenly realized that the image of Elliot Grant kept returning to her mind in a very undemanding way. The old coat, the paper bag of pastries, the stray dog slips and spills the cocoa. None of those details belonged to the kind of man who had once hurt her. Elliot didn't talk about the future, didn't ask what she wanted in 5 years, didn't look at her with a measuring gaze. Just a safe date, Clara told herself, as a way to keep her balance. A man without ambition, not a threat. She thought of Snowy, the dog lying quietly at Elliot's feet, gentle but wary, as if he had learned not to trust too early. There was something about that dog that softened her. Snowy didn't rush toward her, didn't demand anything. He was just there, existing, letting her decide the distance. That afternoon, Clara stopped by Holly and Ink again, this time not for a date. She brought a stack of exams to grade and chose her usual table by the window. The snow was falling more heavily now, blanketing the sidewalk in white. As she bent over a student's essay, something brushed lightly against her leg. Snowy. The dog stood there, tail wagging gently, eyes lifted as if politely asking a question. Elliot sat at a table a few steps away, a cup of coffee in front of him, a book open halfway. He looked up, a little surprised, then smiled. Sorry, he said quietly. He missed you. Clara laughed, bending down to gently pat Snowy's head. He probably just misses the cookies. Maybe, Elliot replied, his tone dry but his eyes soft. But I don't. The words came naturally, without any heavy implication. And precisely because of that, they made Clara pause for a moment. Not because she thought he was flirting, but because there was no rush in his words, no expectation. They didn't sit at the same table. They didn't call it a date. Just two people sharing the same space, occasionally exchanging a few comments about the weather, about books, about how Christmas made the cafe busier than usual. Elliot didn't ask why she was there alone. Clara didn't ask why he always came with Snowy. When she stood up to leave, Snowy followed her to the door, then stopped and looked back at Elliot as if asking permission. Clara smiled softly, opened the door to let the dog step out for a moment, then handed the leash back to Elliot. I think, she said, hesitating slightly, I'm not very good at forever. Elliot didn't ask for anything more. He simply nodded, as if it were information to be carefully kept. Then today is enough. Clara stepped outside, snow touching her hair, cold but pleasant. On the way home, she thought about the wedding dress still lingering somewhere in her memory, about the invitations already sent, about a future once drawn so clearly and erased by a single sentence. She no longer believed in forever, Clara thought, opening her car door and watching the snow fall against the windshield. She only believed in today, and strangely enough, for the first time in a long while, today didn't scare her. Clara Whitmore realized there was something very strange about Elliot Grant after their first date. He was a man who didn't ask. He didn't ask about her past. He didn't ask about her salary. He didn't ask why she was still single or whether she had ever loved someone long enough to believe in forever. He didn't pry, didn't probe, didn't throw questions at her the way men often do, like invisible hooks, waiting to see where the other person might get caught. He simply listened. and he spoke very little. Somehow that left Clara feeling both relieved and unsettled. The next morning, standing in front of the mirror, tying her wool scarf, Clara suddenly found herself thinking about a very simple, very undramatic sentence Elliot had said when they stood up to leave. "I hope you have a gentle Christmas. Not, I hope we see each other again. No, I'll call you." Just a wish, as if he expected nothing more than for her to be okay. Gentle, Clara repeated the word to herself, scrunching up her nose. Who wishes someone a gentle Christmas? And so, for no legitimate reason at all, she began to notice the empty spaces where he didn't appear. She stopped by Holly and Ink on Wednesday afternoon to grade papers. No gray coat in sight. She laughed at herself, muttering that she hadn't made plans with anyone. On Thursday, she arrived at the school library earlier than usual. While shelving books, she heard a familiar sound, the steady, unhurried turn of pages. Elliot stood at the end of the aisle, Snowy lying neatly at his feet, chewing on something that made a distinctly unlibrary-like crunch. Clara turned around, folding her arms. "You don't think the library has rules about chewing food?" Elliot startled, nearly dropping his book. "I thought those rules only applied to humans." Snowy looked up, utterly innocent. "So what are you doing here?" Clara asked, her voice gentler than she expected. "Reading," he replied, as if it were the most obvious answer in the world. "And waiting." "Waiting for whom?" Elliot shrugged. "A good book." She laughed. "You're really not good at answering questions." "Good," he said. "I'm not very good at asking them either." They didn't sit together. There was no defined date, just small, overlapping moments. A nod as they passed each other, a brief comment about the weather, one instance when Snowy tugged too hard on the leash, and Elliot nearly collided with a bookshelf. "Are you following me?" Clara asked half jokingly, half seriously, when they happened to leave the library at the same time. Elliot looked down at Snowy, thinking very carefully. "If I am, I'm doing a terrible job. I always arrive after you." She burst out laughing, the sound coming so quickly that it surprised even her. The third time they ran into each other was at the bus stop, on an afternoon when the wind was so strong it blew the snow backward. Clara struggled with her umbrella. No sooner had she opened it than the wind flipped it inside out, a cruel reminder of winter weather. Elliot stood a few steps away, watching the scene with an expression that was half sympathetic and half barely holding back laughter. "Don't," Clara warned when she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. "I'm not laughing," he said quickly. "You're about to. It's just that umbrella looks very determined." Snowy barked once, as if in agreement. Without saying anything, Elliot handed her his umbrella. She looked at him, raising an eyebrow. "What about you?" "I have a coat," he replied, "and a dog with thicker fur than I expected." Snowy puffed out his chest proudly. They waited for the bus in silence, but not an awkward silence. It was the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Clara realized she didn't feel the urge to say something, just for the sake of it. She didn't need to talk about a tiring day of teaching. She didn't need to explain why she liked standing in the corner of the bus stop. Elliot didn't ask, and strangely enough, she didn't feel overlooked because of it. The bus arrived. Elliot stepped back, letting her board first. "Get home safely," he said. "You're not taking the bus?" she asked. "I'm walking," he replied. "Snowy likes it." "Snowy likes a lot of things," Clara remarked. "Yes," Elliot nodded. "He especially likes you." Clara paused for a beat, then stepped onto the bus and turned back to look at him through the glass. Elliot stood there, one hand holding the leash, the other lifting in a very small wave, as if afraid of causing a disturbance. She sat down, watching the snow slide past the window, and realized a very strange feeling was beginning to stir inside her. Not excitement, not anxiety, but curiosity. A kind of curiosity without caution attached. In the days that followed, their coincidences became a quiet joke between them. At Holly and Ink, Elliot always arrived exactly 5 minutes before or after Clara. At the library, he always chose the aisle next to hers. At the bus stop, Snowy was always the first to notice her. "Do you really have nothing else to do?" Clara asked once, when Snowy tugged Elliot toward her again. Elliot thought about it. I do. Then why aren't you doing it? Because this seems more important. What is this? Letting things happen naturally. Clara opened her mouth to say something, then stopped. She realized she was smiling more than usual, and it didn't scare her. Elliot still didn't ask for her phone number. He didn't text. He didn't define a proper date. He simply appeared, close enough to be noticed, far enough not to intrude. One evening, when Clara left the cafe later than usual, she turned back and saw Elliot tying Snowy's leash. She stood there for a few seconds, hesitating, then spoke. Elliot, he looked up. Yes? You know, she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. Most men I've met ask a lot of questions. And? You don't. Elliot smiled faintly. I think, if you want to talk, you will. Clara nodded. She stepped outside, the snow falling quietly. After a few steps, she turned back. Elliot? Yeah? Thank you for not asking. He looked at her, his gaze softening just a little. You're welcome. Clara continued walking, her heart lighter, her mind calmer. She didn't know where these undefined meetings were leading, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the need to know the answer in advance. And in the thin layer of snow, between coincidental encounters and questions never asked, something very slow, very gentle began to grow. Not forever, just today. And that was enough. Christmas arrived without knocking. It slipped into the city through the smallest things. A string of lights hung earlier than usual, a hint of cinnamon in the air, music playing more softly on streets that were normally loud. For Clara Whitmore, this Christmas didn't arrive with grand plans. It came with a gradual slowing of life, little by little, as if someone had gently placed a hand on time's shoulder and said, "Don't rush." She noticed it one weekend afternoon, standing in the middle of the Christmas market in the central square. Wooden stalls formed an arc, strung with warm yellow lights, selling gingerbread, hot chocolate, and handmade crafts that were clumsy but charming. Children ran back and forth, leaving trails of laughter in the cold air. Clara was bending down to browse a stall selling used books when she heard a familiar voice behind her. What do you think about buying a reindeer-shaped candle that looks more like a goat? She turned around. Elliot stood there in a gray coat, Snowy sitting close at his feet like a white shadow. In his hand was a candle with crooked antlers, his expression utterly serious, as if weighing an important moral decision. Are you negotiating with a candle? Clara asked. I'm trying to, Elliot replied. But the vendor says this is art, and art doesn't get discounted. Clara laughed. You're bad at bargaining. Seems so, he admitted. I always feel awkward haggling over things people made by hand. You should practice, she said. It's Christmas. In the end, Clara paid for the candle while Elliot was still fumbling for his wallet. He looked at her, slightly embarrassed. I'll pay you back. No need, she said softly. Consider it an early Christmas gift. Elliot nodded, clearly unaccustomed to having someone pay for him. Snowy let out a very small bark, as if approving the arrangement. The days that followed unfolded in small scenes, flowing into one another like a slow montage. One afternoon, Clara brought Elliot to her classroom to help hang decorations. The room glowed with twinkling lights, colored paper, and crayon drawings of Santa Claus, some fat, some skinny, some with crooked hats, and many who looked rather poor. Why is every Santa wearing patched clothes? Elliot asked, bending down to look at one drawing. The kids say, Clara replied, trying not to laugh, that Santa has to save money to buy gifts for everyone. That makes sense, Elliot said. I like this version. He helped fix a flickering string of lights, climbing onto a chair so awkwardly that Clara had to stand below and hold it steady. You sure about this? She asked as the chair wobbled slightly. Pretty sure, he replied. If I fall, at least it'll be for a good cause. For Christmas lights? For the kids, he corrected very seriously. Snowy, however, was not nearly as serious. While Clara turned away to grab some tape, Snowy managed to squeeze into the corner of the classroom where a fake Christmas tree had just been set up. Within seconds, the room erupted in a very un-Christmas-like crash. The tree tipped over, ornaments rolled everywhere, and Snowy stood in the middle of the chaos, tail wagging enthusiastically, looking extremely proud. Snowy! Elliot exclaimed. The children burst into laughter. Clara covered her mouth, half shocked, half amused. Looks like he doesn't like Christmas trees. Or he thinks it's a toy, Elliot sighed, bending down to set the tree upright again. I'm sorry. It's fine, Clara said, still smiling. At least the kids will remember this Christmas. That evening, they returned to holly and ink. The cafe was busier than usual, voices blending with softly playing Christmas music. Elliot helped rehang a string of patio lights that had come loose. Clara stood in the doorway, watching him with Snowy at his feet, golden light wrapping around them in a gentle glow. She realized she had begun to look forward to moments like this, not because of plans, not because of promises, but because of the repeated, steady presence that asked for nothing. Some afternoons, Clara arrived at the cafe, and Elliot was already there. Other times, she came first, and Snowy was always the first to notice her when Elliot walked in. They never said, "See you." They only ever said, "Oh, there you are again." One evening, as Clara was tidying up tables after closing, she lingered longer than usual, pretending to check her phone even though the battery was dead. She looked out the window, where snow was falling quietly, and realized she was waiting. Waiting for the wind chime. Waiting for a gray coat. Waiting for Snowy to pull a little too hard on his leash. When the doorbell finally rang, Clara didn't startle. She simply smiled, very faintly, as if she had known all along. Elliot stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. I'm late. It's okay, Clara said. I haven't left yet. They sat down, saying nothing for a few seconds. Snowy lay under the table, calmer than usual. Clara looked at the steaming cup of tea in front of her, then at Elliot. Do you notice, she said slowly, that Christmas this year is different? Different how? Slower, she replied, and easier to breathe. Elliot nodded. Maybe because no one is trying to make it perfect. Clara smiled. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside the cafe, the warm lights stayed on. And in the days without appointments, without promises, she realized something small but very real. Christmas no longer made her feel lonely. It was simply there. And so was he. There are people who love words. And there are people who love by bending down, rolling up their sleeves, and doing things so small that if you're not paying attention, you might think they happened on their own. Elliot Grant belonged to the second kind. Clara realized this one weekday afternoon when the snow had just melted into small puddles along the walkway in front of her mother's house. The wooden fence in the backyard, the one that had been leaning and wobbling for months, had finally started making an unsettling creaking sound whenever the wind picked up. Clara had planned to call a repairman, then forgotten, then postponed it again. The way people postpone things that aren't urgent, but never quite leave the back of their minds. That afternoon, just as she set her bag down and slipped off her scarf, her mother called out from the kitchen, "I think someone's in the backyard." Clara stepped outside without even grabbing another coat, and she stopped short. Elliot was there, bent over the fence, his gray coat draped loosely over a wooden post. In his hand was an old screwdriver, its tip chipped and paint-worn. Snowy sat nearby, watching with a very serious expression, like an unpaid construction supervisor. "What are you doing?" Clara asked, both surprised and amused. Elliot looked up, slightly flustered, as if he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. "The fence was loose. I just tightened a few screws." "You could have told me first." "I know," he said, "but it didn't take long." Clara looked at the wooden boards now aligned properly, the new bright screws standing out against the weathered wood. Nothing fancy, just sturdier, safer. "Thank you," she said. Elliot immediately shook his head. "No need." His voice wasn't firm, just decisive, as if thanks simply didn't belong to this kind of thing. Acts like that began appearing more often in Clara's life, quietly, almost invisibly. A stack of new books appeared neatly in the corner of her classroom one Monday morning. There was no sender's name, only a small note tucked inside. For those who love to read but don't yet have their own books. Clara knew who they were, but she didn't say anything. She just stood there, watching the children gather around the stack, their eyes lighting up as if they'd been given a precious secret. Elliot stood at the back of the classroom, leaning against the wall, hands in his pockets, avoiding her gaze, as if afraid of being discovered. "Do you do this often?" she asked when they stepped into the hallway. Elliot shrugged. "Often enough to know where to stand so no one feels uncomfortable." One of those children was Liam, the boy who sat in the back row, whose coat was always a size too big, whose backpack had frayed straps. Clara had often noticed Liam staring at the classroom bookshelf, then turning away quickly as if afraid of being caught wanting something. One afternoon, Clara overheard Liam telling a friend that he might stop coming to school after winter break. "My mom needs me to get a part-time job," he said, trying to sound casual. "And books cost money too." Clara took that story home with her and told Elliot one evening while they sat at Holly and Ink. She didn't know why she shared it, perhaps because he listened without trying to fix things immediately. Elliot only nodded. "Thank you for telling me." The next day, Clara didn't see him at the cafe, not at the library, not at the bus stop. She told herself she shouldn't notice, but the emptiness came faster than she wanted to admit. 3 days later, on Thursday morning, Liam walked into class with a new backpack, not flashy, not expensive, but sturdy, well-fitted. Inside were several textbooks, carefully covered. There was no sender's name, just a small card, written in neat handwriting. "For someone who's trying harder than people realize." Liam read the card again and again, then looked up at Clara. "Ms. Clara, someone thinks I should keep going to school." Clara smiled, her throat tight. She didn't answer. She simply nodded. That afternoon, she met Elliot outside the school. He was waiting as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Snowy lay at his feet, fast asleep. "Liam's okay," Clara said. "Yeah," Elliot replied. "I'm glad." "Someone helped him quietly. Do you think that person would want to be thanked?" Elliot looked off into the distance where thin patches of snow still lingered. "I think some things, if you accept thanks for them, no longer belong to the reason you did them in the first place." Clara didn't argue. That evening, when she got home, Clara stopped in front of the repaired fence. She placed her hand on the solid wooden beam, feeling its real, reassuring firmness beneath her fingers. And in that moment, a thought surfaced, quietly, without urgency. "He isn't trying to impress anyone." She remembered his words from earlier that day. "If you accept thanks, it's no longer about the original reason." Clara smiled softly, stepped inside, and closed the door behind her. Clara fell ill on exactly the kind of day when winter seemed determined to linger a little longer, as if it wasn't ready to let anyone go. That morning she woke with a dry, burning throat, her head heavy as if wrapped in damp cotton, and a low fever that slowed every movement by half a beat. Outside the window, snow fell fine and steady, so quietly that it made the room feel more hushed than usual. She texted to ask for the day off from teaching, set her phone down, pulled the blanket up a little higher, and thought very briefly that maybe all she needed was a bit more sleep. By noon, when the fever hadn't eased at all, Clara called her mother to say she would be staying home all day. Her mother immediately wanted to come over, but Clara shook her head even though her mother couldn't see her. "I'm fine. It's just a cold." She didn't want anyone to worry, didn't want the house to become noisy when all she needed was quiet. Her phone vibrated again, very softly. Elliot's name appeared on the screen. Is he calling about the string lights? Or Liam? She wondered, then picked up. "Are you okay?" His voice came through, low and unhurried, as if he were afraid that speaking too loudly might tire her out. "I didn't see you at the cafe yesterday." I'm sick," Clara replied, her voice so hoarse it startled even her. "It's nothing serious." There was a very brief pause on the other end. "Have you eaten anything?" "No." She was about to add something to downplay it, but a cough cut her off. "All right," Elliot said. "You get some rest." "You don't need to." Clara didn't finish the sentence before he hung up, very gently, as if he had already made a small but certain decision. She set the phone down and closed her eyes. Maybe he was just busy, she thought, and drifted off without realizing it. About 40 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Clara jolted awake, her head foggy. The bell rang a second time, patient but not insistent. She threw on a thick sweater and went to open the door. On the porch, Elliot stood there. his gray coat dusted with snow, Snowy sitting close at his feet. In his hands were a paper bag and a silver thermos. "Sorry," he said immediately, as if showing up at her door was something that required permission. "I just brought a few things." "You?" Clara froze. "You didn't have to come." "I know," he said, "but I didn't have to stay away either." He didn't step inside, just stood there under the porch roof and handed her the bag. "Chicken soup and hot cocoa, not too sweet." Clara took it, warmth spreading through her palms. "Come inside," she said reflexively. "It's cold out here." Elliot shook his head slightly. "I'll stay on the porch. Once you've eaten, I'll go." For a very brief moment, Clara wanted to argue. But looking at his eyes without expectation, without pressure, she simply nodded. "Okay." In the kitchen, Clara put the soup on the stove and reheated it slightly. The smell of chicken soup filled the air, so familiar it made her throat tighten. She carried the bowl into the living room and sat on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket. Outside on the porch, through the fogged glass, she could see Elliot sitting on the steps. Snowy curled close beside him. Both were very still. She ate slowly, not because the soup was hot, but because of the feeling that someone was there, close enough to keep the house from feeling empty, yet far enough not to make her feel invaded. When she carried the bowl to the sink, a little dizzy, Elliot stood up outside, as if he had heard her footsteps through the glass. She opened the door, letting the cold air rush in. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice still rough. "Really?" Elliot nodded. "You should rest some more." He stepped up one step on the porch and then stopped. "May I check if you still have a fever?" The question was spoken very slowly, as if he had carefully weighed every word. Clara nodded automatically, but when Elliot lifted his hand and his palm barely touched the back of her hand, she suddenly pulled away. Not because she was afraid of him, but because an old memory, sharp and fast, surfaced. Another hand that had once held hers while talking about the future, then let go when things were no longer convenient. "I'm sorry," Clara said immediately, almost whispering. I don't—" "It's okay," Elliot replied at once. He pulled his hand back without hesitation, without a trace of disappointment. "I understand." He stepped back, creating a clear distance. "I'll stay outside a bit longer. If you need anything, just knock." Clara stood there, fingers gripping the edge of her sweater, her heart not racing, but beating deep. She nodded. "Okay." The afternoon passed very slowly. The snow stopped falling, leaving a quiet stretch of white on the porch. Elliot didn't come inside, didn't knock. He just sat there, occasionally stroking Snowy's back, occasionally checking his phone, and putting it away again. When it was fully dark, Clara opened the door once more. Elliot stood up immediately, as if he had been ready all along. "I'm feeling better now," she said. "You should go home. It's cold." "All right," he said. "If you need anything, just call." He didn't say any time. Didn't say "I'll come back." Just a simple sentence, without conditions. After the door closed, Clara leaned against it for a long while. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt as cold as before. She went back to her bedroom, sat on the bed, and picked up her phone. In her photo library, an old picture appeared, her in a white dress, a man standing beside her, both of them smiling politely. She hadn't opened it in months, not because she was still in love, but because she hadn't been strong enough to let go. Clara looked at the photo for a long time. Then very slowly, very decisively, she tapped delete. The screen returned to the home display. No sound, no notification, just a small, sufficient emptiness. Clara set the phone down, pulled the blanket up, and closed her eyes. Outside, winter was still far from over. But in this room, amid the lingering warmth of chicken soup and cocoa, she realized she had crossed something deeply important. Not because someone had stayed by her side, but because someone had known when to step back. He was simply doing what was right and kind. That Christmas Eve arrived without the distant ringing of church bells, without noisy parties or glittering wrapped gifts. It came quietly, like a long breath exhaled by winter after days of bitter cold. Snow fell in fine flakes on the porch, just enough to soften the streetlights and keep the city hushed. Inside the house, Clara prepared only the things most familiar to her: freshly baked gingerbread, still warm, black coffee brewed just right, A small Christmas tree placed by the window, and books that had been read so many times their spines were worn. Nothing was arranged to impress. It was simply the space she lived in, and tonight it allowed one more person to enter. Elliot arrived right on time. He brought no gifts, only Snowy and a small paper bag. "Cookies for Snowy," he said, as if that explanation were necessary, then smiled very lightly. Snowy went in first, making a slow circuit around the living room before stopping by the small tree and sitting down obediently. Elliot hung up his coat and set the bag of cookies on the shelf. Everything happened so naturally that Clara suddenly realized he was no longer a guest. They sat on the sofa, not directly facing each other, but slightly angled inward, a stack of books between them like a soft boundary. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, no music played. The quiet was not empty, it was full. Clara spoke first. "There's something I want to tell you," she said, her voice slow and steady. "Not about the past itself, but about what I took from it." Elliot nodded. He didn't ask. He didn't rush her. He simply shifted a little closer, just enough for her to know he was here. "I used to believe that promises about the future were what made people stay," Clara said. "The clearer they were, the longer term, the more certain they sounded. But then I realized some promises sound beautiful, convincing, perfectly right, until they're no longer convenient." There was no bitterness in her voice, no resentment, just honesty. "And after that, I started to fear the future," Clara continued. "I became afraid of words spoken too early, afraid of being pulled forward before my heart was ready to stand on its own." Snowy shifted, resting his head on her leg. Clara bent down to gently stroke his back, then looked up at Elliot. "But with you," she said softly, "I realized something else." Elliot didn't interrupt. "Not promises," Clara said, "but presence. The way you're there, quietly, without needing to prove anything, without needing to say what comes next, just not disappearing." The room fell silent. Outside, the snow continued to fall evenly, as if keeping time for the moment. Elliot set his book down on the table. He didn't speak right away. When he reached out, it wasn't a hurried gesture. His hand rested on hers, light, steady, deliberate. Not a test, not a search, but a choice. Clara didn't pull her hand away. The warmth passed through her skin, not making her heart race, but steadying it as if it had finally found the right rhythm. Elliot looked at her, this time without looking away, without glancing toward the window. "I don't promise big things," he said. His voice was low, clear, not meant to reassure, only to be honest. "I only promise that I won't leave. Not will, but am." Clara looked at him for a long time. In that moment, she understood that this confirmation didn't come from a question or a plea. It came from the fact that they had both taken a step forward. No one pulled, no one pushed. A sentence rose to her lips, very close. She felt it clearly, fully. But then she smiled, just slightly, and didn't say it. Instead, she squeezed his hand once. Just once, enough to answer. No kiss, no vow, no need to name it. But between the two hands resting side by side, one truth was unmistakable. Tonight, they had chosen to be together. They stayed like that for a long time, reading a few pages, finishing their coffee. Snowy slept soundly between them, breathing evenly. Neither of them felt the need to pull their hand away. When the clock neared 11, Elliot stood up. "I should go," he said. "The snow's going to get heavier." Clara walked him to the door. On the porch, he stopped and turned back to look at her, just a gaze that lingered. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me be here." Clara nodded. "You're already here." The door closed. Clara stood still in the warm house, her hand still carrying the memory of his. That Christmas Eve passed not with promises about the future, but with something far more certain. They didn't say they would walk together forever, but they said through action that from now on they were together. And for Clara, that was enough. That evening, Clara invited Elliot over for dinner. It wasn't a formal invitation, just a very short text sent after her classes ended. "If you're free, I'm making soup. Come by around 7. Elliot replied almost immediately. "I'll be there." Clara cooked with a rare sense of calm. The vegetables were chopped evenly. The water simmered just right. The small kitchen slowly warmed with the scent of chicken soup and toasted bread. She didn't think too much. Some evenings were enough, if only needed to pass at their own pace. And when everything was ready, Clara glanced at the clock. 10 minutes to 7. She washed her hands, dried them, then turned on the TV, just to give the house some background noise while she waited. An old habit left over from the years she lived alone after everything fell apart. The screen lit up with a talk show she paid no attention to. Clara turned her back to it and reached up to take bowls from the cabinet. A voice drifted in from the living room, deep, clear, familiar enough to make her freeze mid-motion. She turned around. The man on the screen was speaking at a podium, bright auditorium lights shining directly on a face she knew all too well. A dark suit, straight posture, a composed gaze. Elliot. The caption beneath the image appeared clearly, leaving her nowhere to hide. Elliot Grant, CEO, Grant Horizon. Clara stood still, not in shock, not in surprise, but caught in a slow, spreading sensation. The feeling of everything suddenly clicking into place. On the screen, Elliot spoke about education, about staying long enough with things that didn't yield immediate returns. The host nodded, mentioning a multi-million-dollar funding package for public school students and libraries. The numbers scrolled across the screen, then disappeared. But inside Clara, the pieces were lining up. The books that had quietly appeared in her classroom. The new backpack was placed in the principal's office. The small cards with neat handwriting, slightly slanted to the right. The way Elliot always deflected questions about his work. The way he stood on her porch the night she had a high fever, never stepping inside. Not because he was poor, but because he had chosen not to let her know. The doorbell rang. Clara flinched almost imperceptibly, not from the sound, but because time had finally caught up. She remained where she was, one hand resting on the kitchen counter, the TV still playing behind her. The bell rang again. She didn't turn off the TV, didn't change the channel. She stood there a few seconds longer, long enough for the sharp ache to settle into something clearer. She wasn't hurt by who he was, but by the fact that he hadn't trusted her enough to know the truth. Clara inhaled slowly, then opened the door. Elliot stood there, his coat dusted with snow, Snowy sitting close at his feet, familiar as on any other evening. "You're right on time," she said. Elliot smiled, then paused when he noticed the glow from the TV behind her. In that moment, they both understood. The secret was no longer in his hands. Elliot stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He took off his coat and hung it on the hook as he always did. A habit so familiar that Clara realized it hurt more than the surprise moments earlier. Snowy ran into the living room first, stopped between them, then looked up at Clara, tail wagging lightly. Clara stayed by the kitchen counter. The TV behind her remained on. Pale blue light spread across the floor, the walls and the tension stretching between them. Elliot followed the light with his eyes. He understood. He didn't speak right away. He simply inhaled slowly, as if accepting that this moment had finally arrived. Not in the way he had prepared for, but in a way he could no longer avoid. "I turned on the TV while waiting for you," Clara said first. Her voice was steady, not raised, not trembling. "I wasn't planning to watch." Elliot nodded. "I know." She looked at him. "You always knew, didn't you?" The question wasn't an accusation. It sounded more like a late confirmation. Elliot didn't move. "Yes." Silence fell. Snowy lay down in the middle of the room, curling up, completely indifferent to the shift in the air. "You're the CEO of Grant Horizon," Clara said. Not as a question, just placing the truth into the room. "Yes. The education forum. Tens of millions in funding." She paused. "The books, the students, the cards." Elliot didn't interrupt. Each thing she named he let remain there. No denial, no explanation. "I recognize the handwriting," Clara continued. "That slant. I've looked at it long enough not to mistake it." Elliot lowered his head slightly. "I didn't intend for you to find out this way." "But you also didn't intend for me to know," Clara said. The sentence wasn't heavy, but it landed deep. Elliot looked up. His eyes didn't avoid hers. "I was afraid. Clara smiled faintly, not because it was funny. Afraid of what? I was afraid, Elliot said slowly, that if you knew, everything between us would stop being coffee afternoons, quiet evenings, small things I could do without being seen differently. Clara listened. She truly listened. That perhaps was what hurt him most. I was afraid the way you looked at me would change, he went on. Afraid you'd have to carry another world. My world, when you'd only just learned how to trust again. Clara was silent for a few seconds. Then she spoke, her voice lower than before. You thought I needed to be protected from the truth. Elliot didn't answer, but his silence was the answer. I'm not hurt because you're rich, Clara said. I'm not hurt because you have power or money. Those things are just context. She took one slow step closer, not to close the distance, just enough for the truth to stand between them. I'm hurt, she continued, because you didn't trust that I was strong enough to know who you really are. Elliot closed his eyes for a very brief moment. When he opened them, his voice was rougher. I was afraid of losing you. But you put us at another risk, Clara replied. The risk that I would realize you trusted me less than I trusted you. There were no tears, no anger, just a very real exhaustion. Elliot took one step forward, then stopped. The distance remained, as if they both understood that touching now would break everything. I never thought you were weak, Elliot said. I just thought I didn't need to know, Clara interrupted softly. And that's what hurts. The room sank into silence. The TV still played images of the auditorium behind them. Elliot on screen smiling, shaking hands, signing papers. Another version of him, strangely distant. Clara reached out and turned off the TV. The light vanished. Only the two of them remained in the familiar warm yellow glow. I need time, Clara said. Not to leave, but to place my trust back where it belongs. Elliot nodded. I understand. He didn't ask how long. He didn't ask what they still were. He simply stood there, steady and quiet, as he always had been, though this time it wasn't enough to soothe her. Dinner's getting cold, Clara said softly. Elliot looked at her. I'm sorry. I know, Clara replied, and I know you didn't do this out of deceit. She turned away, walking back toward the kitchen. But I don't know what to do right now. Elliot stayed a few more seconds, then bent down to call Snowy. I'll go, he said. When you're ready, I'm still here. Not a promise. A presence was carefully placed down. Clara didn't turn back, but she nodded. The door closed behind him. And in that house, for the first time since Christmas night, Clara understood something with absolute clarity. Some feelings are strong enough to withstand the truth, but only when the truth is given with trust. Clara didn't say goodbye. She simply disappeared from the places Elliot knew how to find her. On the first day after that evening, Elliot still went to Holly and Ink out of habit. The morning was cold, the glass windows coated with a thin layer of fog. He ordered black coffee, no sugar. Sat at the familiar table near the window, where the light always fell slowest in the morning. Snowy lay under the table, as well-behaved as ever, his head resting on his front paws. He waited, not with anxious expectation, but with a very quiet kind of waiting. The kind belonging to someone who believes another person will appear, because they always have. Clara didn't come. Elliot didn't rush. He opened his book, read a few pages, then closed it, checked his watch, took a sip of coffee that had already gone cold. Snowy lifted his head a few times, looking toward the door whenever the wind chime stirred softly, then lay back down when the familiar figure didn't appear. Looks like the teacher didn't stop by today, the server said, refilling his water. Elliot nodded. Seems so. On the second day, he went to the library where Clara usually graded papers. The long wooden tables were still there. The warm yellow light still hung low. The chair by the window was empty. No stack of notebooks, no cup of chamomile tea. He stood there a few seconds longer than necessary, then walked away. On the third day, he passed by the bus stop near the school, the place where they had once stood side by side on snowy afternoons, not saying much, yet never feeling cold. He stood there for a while, hands in his coat pockets, Snowy sitting by his feet, as if waiting for something that wouldn't happen. Clara didn't text, didn't call, didn't reply. Not because she was angry, Elliot knew that. The way she had looked at him that night carried no resentment. It carried a difficult decision, and decisions like that usually need space. But understanding didn't make the emptiness any lighter. By the fourth day, Elliot noticed something strange. The city was still crowded, still loud, yet every place he passed through felt as though the sound had been drained from it. The cafe still had the clink of spoons against cups. The bookstore still had the sound of turning pages. But there was no rhythm. He sat in his car for a long time before going home, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the engine off. Snowy sat in the back seat, his head leaning against the front seat, watching him patiently. "We did it wrong again, didn't we?" Elliot said quietly, not quite asking Snowy, not quite speaking to himself. Snowy only let out a very soft breath. That afternoon, Elliot returned to Holly and Ink once more. Not out of hope, but because of Snowy. The dog lay in the same old spot under the table, even though Elliot had changed seats. He lifted his head every time the door chime rang, ears twitching slightly, then lowered again, as if he still believed Clara would walk in. Just not yet. Elliot watched Snowy for a long time. "Maybe she needs to know she can leave," he said, his voice low, "without being held back." He had never held Clara back, not with words, not with actions. But he also knew that sometimes keeping things unspoken could be a way of holding on too tightly. That evening, Elliot went home earlier than usual. The apartment was spacious, clean, and so quiet that his footsteps were unmistakable. He hung up his coat, set his keys on the table. He didn't turn on the main lights, just stood there in the dim glow of the hallway lamp. Old fears returned without noise. They didn't attack. They simply sat down beside him, like familiar figures who had never truly left. "Maybe I've always chosen the wrong way to love. Maybe my caution looks too much like a lack of trust. Maybe I'm good at staying with things that need doing, but not very good at staying with the truth." Elliot sat down on the sofa and took off his shoes. Snowy jumped up beside him, curling close, warm and heavy enough to remind him that something real still existed. He didn't regret the things he had done, the books, the students, the quiet choices, but he began to question something else, that perhaps he had grown so used to loving in the shadows that he had forgotten some people need to stand with him in the light. Outside the window, snow began to fall again, thin and slow. Elliot looked out for a long time, not expecting, not calling out. Somewhere in this city, Clara was walking her own path, not to leave him, but to hold on to herself. And for the first time in many years, Elliot allowed himself to fully feel something he had always avoided. The feeling of loss, not from being abandoned, but from realizing he had loved, without enough courage. The letter arrived one morning a week later, a cream-colored envelope resting among a pile of advertising mail at her front door. No logo, no return address, just the name Clara Whitmore handwritten on the front, the lettering neat, slanted ever so slightly to the right. Clara stood in the hallway for a long moment, her coat still on, her bag hanging loosely from her shoulder. She didn't need to open the letter to know who had written it. Some things, once etched deeply enough into memory, are recognizable at a glance. A week had passed since that night. She had returned to school, taught her classes, graded papers, and attended meetings. In the afternoon, she walked home through the biting cold of January. Life hadn't collapsed. It had simply grown smaller. Time didn't erase the pain, but it dulled its edge, just enough that one could look straight at it without turning away. Clara made tea, let the kettle boil, then cool slightly. She placed the envelope on the kitchen table, sat down, and took a slow breath. When her fingers tore open the edge of the paper, the sound was very soft, as if the house itself were holding its breath. "Clara, I've written this letter many times, started it, then tore it up, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I didn't want to choose safe words again. You once told me that some silences are better than explanations, but I also understand that some silences are just fear dressed up as politeness, and my silence hurt you. I owe you the truth. 10 years ago, I went bankrupt. Not the kind of temporary hardship people soften with careful language. I lost everything, my company, my home, the relationships that only existed when things were going well. The woman I was planning to marry left on the very day the bank froze my accounts. She didn't blame me, didn't make a scene. She simply said she couldn't stay in a future that wasn't certain. That day I learned something very dangerous, that love can disappear faster than money. I rebuilt everything from nothing, quietly. I didn't allow myself to believe again, and I swore, privately, that if I ever loved again, I would only do so as myself. No title, no spotlight, no power as a safety net. Then I met you. You with lesson plans stained with tea, worn book spines, the way you spoke about your students as if each one were a story worth protecting. You never asked me how much I had. You only asked whether I would stay. I was afraid. Not afraid of you knowing who I was, but afraid that if you did, everything good between us would start to smell like conditions. I was afraid of being loved again for things that could disappear. And in that fear, I chose silence. A choice I now understand was a lack of courage. I'm sorry. Not because I'm a CEO, but because I didn't trust that you were strong enough to know all of me, including the parts I'm still afraid to face myself. I'm not writing this letter to ask you to come back. I'm writing because I don't want the final truth between us to be a dark screen. If, and only if, you still want to hear me speak in my own voice, I'll be at Holly and Ink at 10 a.m. this Saturday. No suit, no title, no need to return to anything old. Just me, after having had enough time to understand where I was wrong. Elliot. Clara finished reading, set the letter down, then pressed a hand to her chest as if to steady her heartbeat. The tears came quickly without warning. No sobs, just quiet drops, hot and real. She cried for his past, a past she had never been allowed to know. She cried because his pain had led him to choose the wrong way to love. And she cried for something difficult to admit. This letter didn't make her weaker. It made her feel respected. Clara wiped her tears and looked at the clock. 20 minutes to 9. She didn't rush, took a warm shower, put on a thick sweater, tied her hair neatly back. She didn't wear much makeup. She didn't choose anything that made her look like she was going on a date. She chose what made her herself after 2 weeks of standing still long enough for the trembling to stop. Before leaving, Clara paused in front of the mirror. Her face still carried traces of a night of tears, but her eyes were different, clearer, steadier. She locked the door, took a breath, then stepped outside. Clara arrived at Holly and Ink 15 minutes early, not because she was worried Elliot wouldn't come, but because she needed an extra breath before stepping into this moment. A moment that no longer belonged to Christmas, yet wasn't quite the future either. A space in between, where one had to stand on their own. The cafe looked the same as ever. Warm yellow lights, dark wood, old bookshelves carrying the scent of paper that had lived through many seasons. She chose the table by the window, where the morning light fell most gently, hung up her coat, set her bag down, ordered chamomile tea, the drink she always chose when she needed to keep her heart steady. It wasn't 10 yet. Clara opened the book she'd brought with her, but she didn't read. Her eyes lingered on the first page for a long time, then drifted away. She heard the door chime several times, each time lifting her head by reflex, then lowering it again when it was someone else. 10 o'clock. She glanced at the clock, didn't shift her posture, didn't breathe faster, just acknowledged it. 10:03. The door chime rang. Clara looked up, unhurried, and saw Elliot standing in the doorway, his breath still visible in the cold air. He wasn't wearing a suit, no tie, just a dark coat, a charcoal sweater, his face calm but a little more tense than usual, like someone who had arrived at the right place but wasn't sure he was allowed to step inside. Snowy followed behind him, trotting in first, stopping right beneath Clara's table. He looked up at her, tail giving a single, small, steady wag. Clara smiled for the first time that morning. Elliot saw that smile, and some of the tension on his shoulders eased. He walked over, not fast, not slow, not circling. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Traffic." "It's okay," Clara interrupted softly. "Just 3 minutes." No reproach, no keeping score, no need to prove anything. Elliot sat down across from her. The distance between them was no different from before, but this time, there was nothing suspended between them anymore. They sat still for a few seconds. No one rushed to speak. No one looked away. The light from the window touched the tabletop, their hands, the space between them. Just enough for everything to exist without needing to be named. "You came early," Elliot said. "Yeah." "Did you wait long?" Clara shook her head. "I was just here." The answer made Elliot smile faintly. Not a smile of relief, but the smile of someone who had just been allowed to set their luggage down. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, without raising her voice, without trembling, "You can't disappear again." Not a threat, not a condition, but a boundary set clearly. Elliot didn't blink. He nodded. "I won't." "No, I promise." "No, this time." Just a sentence short enough not to become an empty vow. Clara inhaled. She didn't need him to explain again. Didn't need to hear about fear. Didn't need careful justifications. Those things were already in the letter, and she had read it closely enough to know he wasn't avoiding the truth. She reached for his hand on the table. Elliot closed his fingers around her smaller hand. "I don't need you to become a different version of yourself," she said. "I just need you to be present, even when things aren't easy." "I know," Elliot said, "and I'm here." This time, when he said here, it wasn't a promise aimed at the future. It was a reality unfolding in the present. She looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, the feeling in Clara's chest was no longer cautious hope or quiet defense. It was a new steadiness, not loud, but rooted. "We won't go back to where we were," she said, "and we don't need to know where we're going." "Just go together," Elliot finished. Clara smiled. "That's enough," he smiled back. Outside the window, the snow was no longer falling. The city was beginning a very ordinary morning. Inside that small cafe, after fractures and silences, two people sat across from each other, not reconciling in a loud way, not promising anything grand, just choosing to stay. And this time, Clara knew, it wasn't out of fear of losing each other, but because they had both learned how not to disappear from themselves. A year later, morning arrives more slowly. Not because the sun is lazy, but because the small house on the edge of town seems to have learned how not to rush. Sunlight spills across the wooden porch, settling over the flower pots Clara planted with her own hands. Wildflowers, unarranged, blooming in their own way. The garden isn't large, but it's enough for spring to return each year, enough for summer to carry the scent of warm earth, enough for autumn to drop its leaves right on time. Elliot makes coffee in the kitchen, sleeves of an old sweater pushed up, no suit, no phone buzzing nonstop. Just the sound of boiling water, a spoon tapping against a mug, and birds outside the window. He brings 2 cups out to the porch and sets them down on a wooden table marked with a few scratches. Scratches from real life. Clara is already there, a notebook open on her lap. She writes in the mornings, not to publish, not to meet deadlines, just to give her thoughts somewhere to go. On the notebook cover, a faded line reads, "Write the way you live, slowly and honestly." "You forgot to drink your coffee again," Elliot says. Clara looks up and smiles. "I remember. I just wasn't done with the thought." He places the cup in her hand. Their fingers brush lightly, a habit that needs no reminding. Snowy lies at their feet, older now, heavier, breathing slowly. His once golden fur has turned gray around the muzzle. He no longer runs laps around the garden. He chooses stillness, as if he understands that some joys don't require movement. The narrow road in front of the house is quiet. A little farther away, the new library has been open for 6 months. There's no donor's name carved into the entrance. Just a simple wooden sign, "Library, open to all." Inside, shelves are full of books, including old ones carefully preserved. In one corner, children have drawn imperfect pictures. Poor Santas, small houses, dogs sleeping under tables. Elliot likes walking past the school every morning. No one recognizes him, and he likes it that way. He helps children cross the street, tightens a loose doorknob, straightens a crooked bookshelf. Things that don't need credit. Clara teaches in the mornings and writes in the afternoons. Her first book didn't make a noise when it was released. It found its readers in its own quiet way, people who needed to be reminded that kindness doesn't need a stage. On the opening page, Clara wrote a simple dedication. For those who chose to stay, they don't talk much about what we've been through. Those things lie still, like pebbles underwater, not gone but no longer cutting their feet. They've learned when to ask, when silence is enough, and how not to disappear, even when tired. In the afternoon, clouds drift by slowly. Clara sets her pen down and rests her head against Elliot's shoulder. His shoulder is warm, steady, familiar. Snowy shifts, adjusting his position to lie a little closer. The world shrinks to that porch, the one place where nothing needs to be proven. 5 years pass in much the same way. The small house is still there, with a few more scratches, a few more flower pots. The school adds new classrooms. Clara publishes her second book, then her third. Elliot still lives simply. He still runs the company, still donates anonymously to educational projects, still grows tomatoes that get sunburned every season, burns toast because he forgets to flip it, and still doesn't like talking about himself. One late afternoon, sunlight tilts gold. Lucy, their 3-year-old daughter, sits between them on the porch steps. She has soft hair and questioning eyes. Lucy leans against Elliot's shoulder, one hand holding Clara's finger, gently swaying as if keeping time for the whole world. "Dad," Lucy asks, "why doesn't that library have anyone's name on it?" Elliot thinks for a moment. "Because some things are better without a name." Lucy nods, satisfied with the incomplete answer. Snowy lies at their feet, old and calm, breathing evenly. Clara watches the scene for a long time and feels so full she needs nothing more. She leans over and speaks very softly, more like a note to herself than to anyone else. "I didn't love you when you were a CEO. I loved you when you didn't need to be anyone and still chose to stay." Elliot doesn't reply. He just squeezes her hand lightly, enough to give the words a place in this life. Outside, the wind moves through the garden. Inside, a small family sits together, not loud, not on display, just staying every day in the most ordinary way. And that is happiness.